Fantastic. Well, I'm here with Daren. Daren is at the moment in Falmouth, recently moved there from Limbrick Wood up in Coventry. And I've known Daren for years and years, although we lost touch for quite a long time. And principally, I knew Nicky before I knew you, didn't I, Daren?
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
So I met him through his wife, really, although she wasn't his wife at the time. And he is incredibly creative, unbelievably talented on a whole host of levels. Doesn't believe it, but it is so true. And the minute I thought about doing this Future Church series, Daren came to mind.
Wait.
So Daren, it's great to have you with us and to talk to you.
Thank you. Bless you.
Fantastic. I wanted to kick off really and get your sort of, tell us a little bit about yourself. Tell us a little bit about your context, and then we'll get into how do you think church has got to become?
Okay. Well, we were chatting a moment ago, weren't we, about various things that we've done and where we've come from and where we're going. And probably one of the biggest things for me, and I don't know whether this is helpful or not, but I'm the guy that can put my hand up and say imposter syndrome, for that lovely intro that you've done there. I'm like, wow, he sounds an interesting guy. I'd like to meet him. And I think I've always been in that place. Someone once said to me, it might have even been you, are you a Peter or are you a Paul? And I didn't know what that meant at the time. But are you wearing that side of the academic, you maybe get everything in neat places, you know where you're going and you've worked it out? Or are you the guy that puts your foot in your mouth? And I'm like, well, I can put both feet in my mouth. And I tend to take those steps of saying, well, okay, they're not completely miscalculated steps. They're not foolish steps. But actually, I suppose there's those faith steps. If God says go, okay, I'm going to go. And then I start to see how that unravels as we go. And I'm not afraid to make mistakes. I mean, I love building stuff. You say I'm a creative guy. I love building things. I've just been building some stuff out the front of my shed to make it look really nice. And there's the two lot of beach huts that are out the front. The first one, if you look at it closely, it's a bit of a disaster because I made all my mistakes. Second one, dead proud of it. But I think that's my faith journey, is that God takes me into those places where I say, okay, if you need someone to step there, and it's not necessarily a conscious decision, I kind of find myself in these places, and then God says, okay, now you're here, I'm going to show up, and this is what we're going to do. So, when you say I'm creative, I think, it might be, but I think I'd like to say I'm obedient in what God calls me to, and then I'm not fearful of trying to work those things out when we step into those places.
Okay, so partnership is really important to you, partnership with God and both being led by him and sometimes trying to lead him. That's always been the case, I think, in terms of all the time I've known you.
Yeah. And I think, it's looking back, isn't it? I think when it's the hindsight wisdom stuff that we can end up with a lot of the time. And actually seeing how God puts stuff in place. I mean, we were talking a minute ago and I was saying about how God answers prayer with the no, slow, grow, go stuff. And I'm in a slow place at the moment. God is saying to me, Daren, slow down. You've come somewhere new, but slow down.
Yeah.
But actually, in the midst of that, there's been some amazing faith steps that we've taken.
Okay.
And just by putting it out there, God shows up. Or if I was to put it the right way around, God is already there doing something. I've moved into that place of partnership with him.
Yes.
And now he's doing the releasing. And that for me, I suppose, people might say that's me being creative. I kind of look back at it afterwards in hindsight and go, wow, I could claim that one. But, it is all God at the end of the day.
Yeah. That's true. And it's amazing, isn't it, that God allows us to sometimes pick up the bouquets. And, and he stands there on the sidelines and goes, yeah, didn't you do well?
Yeah. Well, I think you did that yourself, I'm sure, when you equip other people and then they get all of the praise and they say, wow, I didn't know that person could do that thing. And, you're thinking, yeah, we did that together.
Yeah.
But the blessings abound. And, I think that's where we see true. People grow and encourage and release. And where God is gracious to us like that, it allows us to have the same grace to others, doesn't it?
Absolutely. So from where you're coming from your perspective, as you look at ministry and look at future ministry where you're now based, give us a flavour of how you see church as having to become. Where do you see, not necessarily Falmouth at the moment, because you probably haven't got a clue where it's going in the next 10 years, but how would you see church in 10 years' time? What's it got to be?
It's really interesting because the gap that I had between being at Limbrick Wood and coming here and trying to wrestle with stuff, so not necessarily even looking at church context then, I suppose it's going back to Acts. Was that the perfect church? Was that the place where everybody had it right? And they were meeting each other's houses. They were doing, I think the Anglican Church is doing a lot of these things with missional communities, I think is what they call them, where it is these smaller groups that are there. Now, one of the things I was chatting to someone about was to say, I think maybe the established church as we see it, with big buildings and big gatherings and everything else, and that's the thing. I really wonder if in 10 years' time we're going to be much smaller packets of smaller collective bodies, probably much more like the church looked like in Acts, if that's a kind of succinct answer for you.
No, I find that really interesting, because one of the things I think I've realised over the past, I guess over the past 10 years, is that big denominational structures, big hierarchical structures are becoming increasingly untenable. Financially, they're untenable. They're difficult to service. They're difficult to maintain. And even the fact that actually they have to be maintained gives us a real problem when it comes to mission. So I mean, I would agree with you. I would agree with you that church is going to become much more disestablished, much more decentered, much more dynamic, to be a typically Baptist minister and do 3Ds.
Yeah, that was very good. I like that.
Yeah, I know. Whoa, it just tripped off the tongue there. But, you're right. It's got to become much more interpersonal. It's got to become more about relationship and getting into, well, it's incarnational, isn't it? It's becoming Christ in the midst. Yeah. And so, and that's interesting. It's interesting to hear you say that. How do you see that panning out? When you look at where we are now and where you believe we've got to get to, how do you see that working?
I think it's going to be forced upon us, if I'm really honest.
Wow. Okay.
I think it is, because I mean, looking at where the world is heading right now, looking at some of the pressures that we're up against, I think really the church is only 1 or 2 court cases away from stuff becoming illegal. There's a real momentum. Is Christianity going to become outlawed? I think when we see, if we look at the scriptures and we look at repeated patterns of behaviour, the church grows when oppression comes. Yes. I've mentioned the Acts model there. Well, okay, there's the perfect church. What happens when it's all well and good? I don't say necessarily it's God, but what happened in the midst of that is it's scattered. We had this great thing. It wasn't supposed to be heaven on earth at that moment, although you might have been able to describe it as that. What happened? They get scattered to Samaria and the ends of the earth. The church goes and grows. And I think that's the commission, isn't it? I suppose it drops into your head. We're to go into all the world. Yes. And I wonder if a little bit of oppression that's going to come. I've arrived down here in Falmouth. I've already made the front page of the newspaper for upsetting a certain thing in the community already. And it's just interesting that the news wants to get hold of that information and then blow the headline out of proportion. But I can see how very easily, and this is quite a minor thing really, that people go, oh really, that made the front page? Must have been a slow news day or whatever. But the fact is that when big and important issues come, and actually I saw a headline, funnily enough, on YouTube up in the top right where it says the little podcast you want to look at, and challenging about where the church is at, and should other things have a more of an influence in our society or have better credibility than church or religion, as they obviously like to put the banner on there. So I think oppression's going to come. I think church, by necessity, will not be allowed to do certain things. Yes. And then I think it will be forced into reshaping itself. Okay. Do you know, that's really interesting, because I was talking to somebody yesterday and I was talking about when the Holy Spirit breaks out. What, to me, one of the first signs that the Holy Spirit is moving, that the church is being blessed, is that there is opposition, because we become a threat to the evil one. We become a threat to the kingdom of darkness in a way that we aren't when we're seeking to be established or we're seeking to be conforming to the patterns of this world. And it's one of the things I've noticed in terms of my own ministry. The times of greatest blessing have often been the times of greatest difficulty. Yeah. And it's really interesting to hear you say that, because you're right. We are increasingly, and in some ways it's our own fault. In some ways we have come across as being
bigoted, was becoming, being narrow, being all sorts of other things. But it seems to me that the antidote to that is not becoming compromised. It's not actually going, okay, well, let's sort of, put on our camouflage jacket and blend in with the crowd and pretend like we're all the same. And so we are, I have some sympathy for what you're saying. And it will differentiate, using a horrible term, I suppose, the men from the boys, won't it? Those that are genuinely Christian will become much more committed, and those who have hung on will probably go, "Ooh, this isn't what I signed up for." I
saw that a little bit back at Limerick Woods, when we first came and God was really doing stuff amongst the community. Some of the lovely people, and they were lovely people, went, okay, this is not for me. Yeah. I thought church was going to be either more sanitized than this. I didn't expect homeless people coming in, or the main church hall to be a place where you take the chairs out and put beds in for homeless people. Not sure I'm really comfortable with that kind of church, which was interesting. And I think actually coming down to Falmouth now, it'll be very interesting to see how church moves from that place of being comfortable and doing things well and being good stewards to actually, I said to somebody the other day, and maybe this is just because you get a bit older and you're not as worried about stuff anymore, but Richard, when did you last go to prison for the gospel? Because it's a good question, isn't it?
It is.
Because when we look at Paul and we look at others, they were beaten, they were thrown in prison. They said this is the word of God. The gospel is offensive. It's life and truth. We know all of those things, but it is offensive and it does challenge the world. And I did say to somebody the other day, I haven't actually been to prison for the gospel yet. Not that's high on my bucket list, But actually, I wouldn't want to get to heaven and kind of say, well, I didn't try hard enough, or I compromised, and it wasn't that thing, So a local newspaper headline over challenging some things that I think are quite dangerous, and funnily enough, as I challenged that locally, it started to bubble up a bit more. Maybe it has created some conversations, but actually that's around them, that's not around gospel. And actually I want the gospel to be the thing which is out there challenging people. It's interesting. And a few years ago I wrote an article, and it was about, are we working from the margins, or has God recentered the agenda? Because it strikes me that the margins are becoming much bigger, much broader. And the more we find ourselves in this intolerant society that is likely to turn its back on very angrily on church, the more we're going to find ourselves identifying with those that God's always identified with. And we're going to find that, 60, 70, 80% of the population of this country actually fall into that category. That's where the centre was all along. And I have this sneaking suspicion that the paradigm shift in the heavenly realms has already happened. We're just catching up with it. It's interesting to see it from a student perspective, because having just landed down here, everything's new. People are inviting me to lots of different places. So I went to the student meet and greet stuff. So I've landed at the beginning of term, and I think they called it student speed dating. So you were churches around tables, and the students went round and did this quick thing. Odd title, but anyway, they went with it again this year. But what I found was the groups, the 4 and 5 that came round, I expected that they were Christians that had come to university and now they're looking to connect with the CU. It wasn't massive numbers, so there might have been about 30 people in the room, but out of that 30, about 4 or 5 of those were not yet saved.
Okay.
And they'd come along and said, well, what is this Christian Union all about? And my friend said I should come and check this out. And I was like, actually, speed dating, we had 5 minutes with these guys, and there's 5 people or 4 or 5 people, so you get about a minute with each person. But actually, just seeing that there's people hungry for the gospel. Yes. And down here, the CU thing that they did through the Freshers Week, they were the most attended organisations throughout that whole week.
Wow. Okay. Interesting. Yeah.
So. And I know a few years ago, I say a few years ago, it must be about 20 odd years ago now, when I was working for the employment services, one of the things I found as I started speaking to people, I used to wear a little ichthus fish on my thing, and on my jacket, and they say, "Oh, what's that all about?" And I was a good conversation starter. But I did find that there was a hunger. Yes. And although the mass media says this is where we're going, or this is church is dead, and all of this stuff, when you actually meet people, they go, "No, I've got real questions." Yes. And actually, when you get to those places of real question.
Yeah.
So I think that's part of the fear element of don't go out there because they all hate you. But actually, when you get out there, say, actually, that's really interesting. Can you answer some questions for me?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, people are desperate for hope, meaning, and purpose, aren't they?
Yeah.
And they are looking, they're looking for what the world has to offer, and they're finding that it becomes sawdust in their mouths, really.
Absolutely.
And so maybe we are at a place where opposition is going to become more, overt, but maybe we're at a time where opportunity is going to be. Did you notice what I did there? Two O's.
Very good.
Two
O's.
I
know. Your 3 points are coming out all over the place.
You're bringing it out of me, man. You're bringing it out of me. I don't normally do this.
That's very good.
But you're right. I mean, I can see that, and I can see how, it's maybe God is in this slow phase. God is preparing us for that.
I mean, it's interesting. I'm literally thinking this out, so I'm just going to this out now. I mean, this men's ministry stuff that I've come down to here, God is just moving amongst men. So I haven't got my 3 or 4 men that said, "Hey, let's meet up." There's someone that God has been using down here. He's a really smart guy, and he's been praying his boots off and trying to build men's ministry for the last 4 or 5 years, and it kind of hasn't happened. But he's been praying. So this is the kind of this might be the slow part that we've been going through.
Okay.
But actually, we had them weekend away. Suddenly, that's 25 men that are actually staying on the weekend away, with about 10 others dropping in.
Right, fantastic.
We've come out of that, and now we've got about 40, nearly 50 men now, plus other men's ministries around the area saying, "Hey, we heard God's doing something. We want to come and be part of that." Now, what I'm thinking about here is that's almost like the collective church. We've done this lovely gathering thing. But what I'm really asking God, what I'm really seeking is, God, we can't sustain that.
No.
So what does that look like?
Yes.
Where are these men? They've either got specialisms or they've got something. Are they going to go into particular groups or huddles that are going to do stuff, and then they can be little fire starters wherever they are?
Yes.
And I'm just thinking that out. I mean, that's my thought process going there. I'm thinking, so the men that I've got at the moment is almost like collective church.
Okay.
But we can't sustain that, which is kind of coming round to your question, what would that then look like? So
yes,
what does that look like in January? Well, I don't know, but it can't be that, but it needs to be something. There will be a collective, but there needs to be something else. And that's kind of your question, isn't it?
That's interesting, isn't it? Because I mean, when I worked for Care for the Family, I went up to St Thomas Crooks in Sheffield, and their Philadelphia church plant, which was, it always made me smile, really, because it was huge. I mean, Thomas Crooks was vast, and then, this thing was absolutely enormous. And they decided that actually they were going to release their congregation to actually do basically focus mission around areas of interest. So there was a group, the most successful group at that time in terms of conversions and people coming to faith in Christ, was the group that met in the was it the Pennines? I can't remember. No, in the area just south of Sheffield, in the hills, etc. And they would gather in a car park, and some would go mountain biking, some would go walking, some would go climbing, some would actually go and do some stuff on the water, and then they'd come back together for lunch. Yeah. And they reconfigured the church so that group would meet three times a month, and they would meet as a congregation together centrally once a month. And they saw more men come to faith because they were gathering around an interest group. They were gathering around something that got them out, because men find it so much easier to relate to men working alongside them, doing something together, than sitting in a little circle contemplating the navel. Yeah. And it's an interesting thing to think about, because it is small group, but it's small group that's dynamic. It's small group that actually is engaging with people and giving them opportunity to be themselves and express themselves. Really interesting.
Yeah. So, I mean, to answer your question a little bit, I suppose what I'm chewing over, because it's a really good question you've asked, is what would church look like in 10 years? Well, I think it's almost, this is like a microcosm of what that might be now. If we get that right now, can you apply that same logic to church later? And of course, if oppression comes and you're forced into that, I mean, during lockdown, all of us had to find a different way of operating. And did church die during lockdown? Well, actually, I think the majority of people I've spoken to have said, actually, we blossomed in a whole different way.
Yes.
I mean, I know up in where we were in Coventry, there were a number of people which had negative mental health issues, or they just could not leave their house. As soon as our church went online, our congregation grew with all the people that wouldn't naturally come along to a church building or are unable to come along to a church building. They grew and became our community. And it's like, it's fascinating that they wanted to come and be part of that. And I think also the whole live stuff. I mean, me and my little family here, we've all kind of, we all play instruments, we all do music. We went online and did a morning worship thing. We did an evening worship thing.
They were great.
They were
great. I dipped in on occasions, and they were such fun. They were such fun.
Songwriters, song set. We ended up, I mean, it's not shouting stats just for the sake of it, but we had 40,000 people a week joining in on that little thing out of our garage. And what was, I mean, it just blew me away. Some people would not go back. This was a really interesting thing. Some people would not go back, and if they missed the live part, they wouldn't go back and watch the pre-recorded part of, or the uploaded part of the live. They wanted to be part of the live process while it was live.
Very interesting.
And, you know, because I was chewing over a lot of this stuff and thinking, well, why did that happen, and what made that live? So live is life, I think, used to be the song, didn't it? And it's that being part of it, being in the moment. The whole, can you do online church stuff? Can the Spirit of God move through online church? Well, actually, he seemed to, but it was in the moment. You could watch it back. And funnily enough, I had other regional ministers that used to dip back in, because just the way their day worked, they said I just pretended it was live, and they engaged and did stuff with it, which was really interesting. But it was the live moment when we collectively gathered online. I suppose that's the whole Centurion thing about, don't need to be there. It was also
interesting because, as I say, I dipped into a few of them. One, just to see you and to see Nikki and to see your kids, because there was an element of curiosity, because I've known you for a long time. But you've always been a cheeky chappy, and that came across. Your personality came across. But there was also this sense of it being dynamic and spontaneous and informal and very flexible. And whilst it was obvious that it was planned and it was structured and that you were preparing the songs and things like that, it didn't feel like that. It did feel of the moment.
Bless you.
And it was really interesting to look in on it.
Well, my community up there, I mean, obviously I walked with a lot of community, because we were doing this, I say, primarily for church, because we wanted to worship, we wanted to sing. But there were a lot of people in the community that weren't yet saved, and they joined in with those things. And I tell you what, you sing happy birthday to someone that's not yet saved, that's joined in with the thing. I mean, she dines out on that every year. Every time it's her birthday, she sends me a little picture. Do you remember when you sang me happy birthday online? It was so important to just connect with people. And like you say, being in the moment and of the moment. So what does that look like?
And making connections, isn't it? It's the making of the connection. And it's one of the things that struck me in terms of the lockdowns, that the sense of community, the sense of connection was very real, even though it was virtual. Yeah.
I mean, we tried to do all the Zoom thing. I don't know why Zoom didn't work for us.
Okay.
It just didn't. I think maybe we had a few talkers. I know I'm a talker, but there were a few talkers that just dominated, and nobody else therefore felt they got a look in, and it just fizzled out.
Okay.
But where it was like, okay, here's a structure, we're singing stuff, we're praying for each other, we're talking about the news or whatever else we were doing that day, and people being able to type in and be part of that, and it influenced what we were saying and doing. We responded to that.
Yes.
That created something which I found a lot more people dipped into.
Okay.
And potentially, like I say, unsafe folk would dip into, because they found
how did you actually manage the live chat? I mean, you obviously had the live chat on and operating. Did you have one of you in the room, beavering away, going, and just responding? Or how did you do it?
I literally had my phone right next to because I had a microphone stand, and I just literally had my phone there. And if someone pinged a message in, I could look down and see the message, so I could instantly respond to those things.
Okay.
Or Nikki was catching stuff if I was, and then we just fed those things in and just kept it as real as we could do. But I mean, it was a learning curve. I mean, looking back, whatever the outcome ended up being, we started off with some silly mobile phone thing with us all squeezed in a little room to eventually songs of praise lyrics everywhere. But we grew through that process. And I think part of that growing process, we grew with the community, we grew with those that were there. And that's the important part. I think when we go in with something prescribed and you say, right, this is what it's going to be, come along. Yeah. I think that's the bit I said earlier about God asked me to step out. I'm quite happy to step out into those places. Okay, well, what are you doing, God? Or what are you saying? Okay, I'm your hands and feet. How do we pull that together and make that happen? But if we go out with everything prescribed beforehand, this is what we're going to do, this is how it's going to be, people that aren't very flexible, of course, get upset because they didn't do that right. We need to say, well, how are they responding? How are they doing that? And how do we then come alongside and walk with them?
Yeah. Hey, fantastic. There is so much there, so much for people to consider and to think about. And it's come out of you as a stream of consciousness, which is, in many respects, exactly what I would hope you would do. And I love that image. And it's a really important image, I think, that we are called to be his hands and feet. We are called into a dynamism of relationship with him and therefore a relationship with others, where in many respects, they're setting the agenda. And the agenda inevitably is going to be about the vacuum that they feel inside and a longing and a hunger to actually find meaning and purpose. And if we can meet them there, then we stand a chance of a really exciting future church. Really exciting.
Absolutely. Bless you.
Yeah. Hey, bless you. Thank you so much.
It's good. It's good to be here and connecting again. I'm in my little shed that I've built down the bottom of the garden today.
Yeah, I did notice the decor.
It's also my breath.
Which shed is this? Is this the failed shed or is this the perfected shed?
Oh no, so this is the shed, but because I'd recycled a few windows out the front, I didn't want it to look like a shed, so I built 2 beach huts out the front. They're only facades, but I've got 2 beach huts in my garden. When in Falmouth, you know what I mean? It's
exactly.
Bless you.
Hey, thanks so much a lot. Really, really great.